On a Monday, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby, all the updates from things happening on the weekend as we check on the political agenda. Dan Flynn is Deputy Director of the Australian Christian Lobby. Dan's back with us. Welcome back to 2020, Dan.
Thank you, Neil. Great to be here.
Dan, let's start with the Essendon Football Club. Last week, the big news, I might even venture to categorise it, perhaps one of the biggest line in the sand, big breaking stories that affects our culture here in Australia, where the Essendon Football Club's newly appointed CEO, Andrew Thorburn, was forced to resign due to his Christian beliefs and church involvement. You've obviously been monitoring that along too. What are your perceptions, Dan?
Well, it's an interesting one, Neil. I think it's useful for us to categorise this, in context. So first of all, Israel Folau 2019, that was about his freedom of speech. He said something. Then the Manly 7 earlier this year was about freedom from enforced speech. They didn't want to wear a jersey that said something. And now Andrew Thorburn, another football story, is about freedom of association. So Andrew has said nothing, but attends. In fact, he's the chairman of the board of City on a Hill in Melbourne. Now, and what is an issue here is his association. So I don't think it's very relevant, Neil, that he's the chairman of the board, because any church member, if he was merely a church member, they might have found out, well, you go to City on a Hill. They have said this in a sermon in 2013. What they said was homosexuality is a sin, but they, was a very supportive set of statements, and in there was the phrase homosexuality is a sin. They also said that, we look back and we grieve at the Holocaust. We may look back later and grieve in a similar way about abortion. That was the tone in which all that was said. So this was put to him, and he was basically asked, well, you have to choose your church or the football club, because what's said by City on a Hill, a church which you won't denounce, is inconsistent with our values. So he is being strung up for associating with a church that has orthodox Christian views. And my concern, Neil, is that if the Essendon Football Club is correct, if that's a correct thing to do, then any employer could target any church-going employee and, assert, well, the church you go to, their values are not consistent with the values of this organisation, so you have to go. So it's really a very low watermark for, I suppose, to trip a risk for basically anybody who goes to church.
Anyone who goes to church, and I think you can assess whether you might be at risk, Dan, if your workplace has an inclusion and diversity policy. And there have been workplaces, departments, who've been working on these feverishly now for a number of years, trying to get all these things in place. And if your workplace actually has that sort of policy, then that probably puts you a little at risk, doesn't it?
Well, I think so. We don't want to be alarmist, but I don't think we are. We are in a situation now where being a Christian is a risky business, particularly if you're associating with a large corporation. Now, thankfully, not everyone is buying into this madness. I see today that Deloitte Australia's chief executive, Adam Poey, has, defended Andrew Thorburn, says, look, this is wrong. Deloitte's, they'd be as mainstream as any consulting firm. They're saying, look, when you get rid of Christians like this, you miss out on diversity and the different approaches that come with that, and this is wrong. So I'm glad he's not alone in this. I'm glad that we have other corporates speaking up for Andrew Thorburn, but it's concerning. And Neil, we launched a platform on Friday afternoon to allow people to write to the board of the Essendon Football Club, including its chairman and the AFL, and to say, look, this is absolutely not okay. This is not fair play. This is not something that we will tolerate. And so I imagine that the Essendon Football Club thought, well, look, we'll get a couple of days of bad headlines, then it will blow over. But in truth, over the course of the weekend, over 10,000 people have written to the club and to its board members complaining that Christians aren't welcome at the club and that football culture has become toxic, and making the point that, why should we be able to go to an Essendon football match but have to leave our faith at the gate? So these complaints are being made, and we are in the process of developing a petition to go to Prime Minister Albanese based on this, saying, look, people want him to bring in actual protections for freedom, freedom from this type of dismissal. So that's underway, Neil, to give people some relevant activity.
Dan, late last week there were calls for reinstatement in the CEO role that came from the opposition leader Peter Dutton, and there are calls or speculation that he might, undertake some level of legal action against the Essendon Football Club now. And given you've got this sort of legal background as a barrister, for listeners, where would that sit legally? Is it possible that he might pursue damages here, and should he? Because perhaps some are saying, well, unless you do fight for this right, it'll be completely lost.
Look, you're absolutely right. Religious belief or activity is a protected attribute under the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act, and that means that an employer cannot discriminate against an employee by reason of religious belief. So the law in Victoria is quite clear that he would have a cause of action. So whether or not he chooses is a matter for him. But he should not have to choose between his job and his religious activity. And other protected attributes there are opinions, body, pregnancy. In other words, you don't have to choose between your job and these things. And for the Essendon Football Club, and my view is that to have put this choice to him, that does constitute unlawful discrimination. Now, I'm not a practicing lawyer. I don't have the final say on this, but I think the wording of the legislation is pretty clear.
Dan, you're a Victorian, and, I can't leave a conversation like this without some reflection on the Victorian Premier, who was owning his own faith as a Catholic and thinks that holding positions on marriage and abortion that Andrew Thorburn holds to be abhorrent. Now, some are saying this is the height of hypocrisy, but isn't it the case that, if you're the Premier of a nation, of a state, as you are in Victoria, and you're holding to the views, or are you saying you're actually aligning yourself with the Catholic Church, that it's the same thing as Andrew Thorburn? Shouldn't the Premier be removed?
Well, on strict logic, yes, because no doubt the Pope and church leaders, including Archbishop Comensoli, would have a view that homosexuality is not in line with the Bible, practicing homosexuality, and that abortion is wrong. And so, if he aligned himself with Catholicism, he would be at risk. But what he actually said was that the comments that made on the City on a Hill website in 2013 in those sermons were bigotry, they were hatred, they were absolutely appalling. So he, is having a bet each way, if you like, but he is certainly coming down very hard on Andrew Thorburn and believes that he is unfit to have any senior leadership role in the Essendon Footy Club or anywhere else in society.
Dan, just to, bring the pressure down here for listeners who might be concerned about holding these sorts of views, that these views that are under contention now, these are mainstream views on marriage and family and the value of life of a baby in the womb, and things that we talk about so often on a program like this, being pro-life, being pro-family. It certainly is a major change that these are no longer considered mainstream. That's something that some people will be very concerned about, but some might be thinking maybe I need to revisit how I think about those views. What are your thoughts just for holding firm? Because those views are not going to be changing. They're still going to be the obvious views that we'll hold on to for generations to come.
Look, I think as faithful Christians, we will be persecuted. And, certainly compared to what happens in countries like Pakistan, this is low-level persecution, but it is persecution nevertheless. So we shouldn't change our views. We should always seek to do our best to be faithful to Jesus, faithful to the Bible, faithful to the creation truth of male and female, and the importance of life at every stage. So we must remain faithful even under pressure. That is our Christian calling.
Dan, I think this is the biggest item to be talking about, but there's some other really significant ones. Let's touch on those perhaps quickly. But the March for the Babies on the weekend, how do you describe how the outcome of that was?
Look, it was pretty tumultuous, to be honest, Neil. Bernie Finn was speaking. He's a pro-life MP. The stage was stormed and there was a tussle with Bernie on the stage. So there were quite a number of pro-abortion activists who were very angry in the crowd, wearing devil's horns and, with some pretty horrible signs on their T-shirts, very activated. I think this is all because of Roe versus Wade being appealed in the US. So that's caused a lot of militancy in the pro-abortion movement, and they took vengeance really on the very peaceful mums and dads with babies in strollers at the March for the Babies in Melbourne on the weekend. It's not surprising given the repeal of Roe versus Wade, but it shows the difficult nature of the spiritual battle we are in. Obviously, our fight is not against these people. It's a spiritual battle, and it manifests through people often who are, quite broken themselves, who Jesus loves, but it's something we have to contend with. And they certainly was a battle very visible in Melbourne on Saturday.
Not just simmering along, but at times boiling over, this sort of anti-Christian, anti-life sentiment, and especially being seen in Victoria. You've got a state election coming up at the end of November. Any thoughts on how things are likely to work out with the state election? From what I understand it, Dan Andrews is not really facing a whole lot of stiff opposition, but what are your thoughts for the upcoming election?
Well, there's very strong, sentiment and seem to be backing by polling that Daniel Andrews is quite safe. But in a sense, he's written his own campaign message saying that Christianity is bigotry, hatred, and absolutely appalling. And so I think he has certainly damaged himself here. Matthew Guy does not hate Christians. He's definitely a fellow traveller with Christians. He hasn't been as strong as many would like. But that's quite different to Daniel Andrews, who's been quite militant against Christians. And so I think over the last week, for Christians, Daniel Andrews himself has done the work of designing the messaging that will be deployed, no doubt, by many Christian groups in the lead up to this election.
I noticed there's, at least the opposition in Victoria has got a bit of a headline on reducing the cost of a fare on the train system in Melbourne. There's some things here that some are talking about as positives. Those are not faith issues so much, but so far as these sorts of issues and Matthew Guy as a potential alternative premier, does he have a chance? Do you think, in your estimation?
Look, if he was successful, he would have to beat all the polling that is available. And, there's a question about, would the Andrew Thorburn incident be relevant to the election? Look, it might be. I know the Christians will mobilise on this. And what will be, I think, important for us to do, Neil, is to do some sort of polling now about views and then do that polling at the end of the campaign and just see to what extent this message has cut through. I would think this will have the impact of reducing the margin in his own seat of Mulgrave. Christians will be active in Mulgrave, and there's no doubt that the statements he made last week describing beliefs that almost all of the churches have in Melbourne as bigotry will have an impact.
Time's running short. Let me ask you about one more very important issue, Dan. And that is the fact that the Australian Christian Lobby has now been designated as a hate group. What are your initial reactions to that thought?
Well, this is something by a US organisation and pro-life groups and pro-family groups like the Heritage Foundation get listed in these lists. It's produced by the Southern Poverty Law Centre, who create these lists to basically try to shame pro-family, pro-life groups. At the end of the day, to do that to Australian Christian Lobby is defamatory, it's divisive, and it's just completely untrue. And, this is a left-wing extremist group from America who are basically saying Christians are the problem. And, we're honestly, we have had enough of this, and in a sense, ACL, we're pretty robust, but while we get named in that way in the same week, Andrew Thorburn gets booted from his football club. So, I suppose all the Christians are in this this group or this category of inverted commas, promoting hate. So it is time for the Albanese government to put some real protections in place for people of faith, and we are calling on the Albanese government to do just that.
And for listeners to keep up with where this project would go so far as religious discrimination and protection for believers, I'll encourage you to keep checking the Australian Christian Lobby website. They've got updates on their pursuit of those plans. Dan Flynn is Deputy Director of the Australian Christian Lobby. The ACL website is acl.org.au. The Australian Christian Lobby, acl.org.au, and there may be some ways that you can take action on some of these things we're talking about today and be a part of the solution and not just a bystander. acl.org.au. Dan Flynn, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us today on 2020.
That's my pleasure, Neil. Thank you.